So thank you everyone for joining us today for the fifth webinar in the Clinical Trials Methodology course webinar series. Our presenter today is Valerie Stevenson, and she will be presenting on clinical trial budgeting. Valerie Stevenson is the Administrative Director of the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network, the Clinical Coordinating Center in the Department of Emergency Medicine here at the University of Michigan. Just a couple of housekeeping things. All the microphones are muted except for our presenter. And if you have any questions during the talk, please use the chat box, which is just here on the left of the screen. So thank you everybody for joining again, and turn it over to Val.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Sam mentioned, my name is Valerie Stevenson, and I'm with the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network. And I have no conflicts of interest to share other than that my position here is completely funded by the NIH. So just to start off with that. So what I'd like to do is just really quickly, let me get my orientation with this thing here. Make sure it's advancing properly. Is just kind of review the objectives for today. And then we'll talk about some basics of budgeting. We'll talk about if you're interested in doing a multi-center trial, and just some things to keep in your mind when you're working with presenting a budget. So what we want to do is just talk about, again, the initial steps of creating a budget. And because we have so many here with us today, some of this may be very basic for you, but we like to start with a little bit of nuts and bolts, and then talk about some things that may be related to if you're working with more than one site. Another thing that we want to talk about is the considerations of a budget, and not so much the upfront cost, because many times we know we need to cover the cost of a salary, but just kind of talking about some of those things that may not be as upfront when you're thinking about budgeting. So we'll explore both the upfront and the hidden costs. We want to talk about potential financial models, because there's all kinds of ways to work with people in research, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about different ways, especially too with limited funding, to make sure we're taking advantage of our funds. And the other thing we want to close with is just, or we want to understand, is what things are needed with the proposal. A lot of times it's more than just handing off a set of numbers. There's specific forms that you need to complete, or conflict of interest forms. And the last item that we'll be just talking about is after you're funded, what kind of things you need to be thinking of after the award is made. So, just getting started, when you first, think you have a great idea and you want to apply for a grant, there's all kinds of different funding opportunities. There's those from the NIH, there's the National Science Foundation, there's private foundations. So when you're thinking about your project and the scope of your project, you want to look at and identify the most appropriate funding mechanism for you. If you are looking at a larger scale trial, you're going to be looking at different groups, versus if you're looking at a pilot study, you might be looking or be able to work with a foundation. So when you look at different opportunities, one of the things you want to do, and it seems pretty basic, but it's one of the things that slips by a lot of people, is make sure you actually read the entire opportunity. When you're reading the opportunity, there's all kinds of different sections. Some of them are complex, where you're looking at different web pages and they're telling you, what's maybe conflicting things or not very clear things, but you're kind of clicking all over. And they may be things that are straightforward and they're just listed in different sections. So what you want to do is you want to explore what you're applying for to make sure that you understand the terms of that. So for example, if you wanted to apply for a grant, is there some restriction on if you apply for this grant, you can't participate in any other research? A lot of times that's a huge consideration for people, especially if you already have a small amount of funding on a current project. You don't want to do anything to endanger that project that you're currently working on. Many times an opportunity may be defined by your career path. For example, we recently saw an opportunity that looked like a really great opportunity, but it excluded postdocs and associate professors. So when you read it, it looked like it was open for a wider group of investigators, but then when you looked at it, they were really looking at a junior level investigator, entry level investigator. So you want to make sure that before you spend time putting it together, that it's actually something that is appropriate for you. Another thing is you want to just look at the steps in the submission process. And maybe just more than applying for a grant, you may see an opportunity for funding and they want someone who's already turned in a pre-proposal or someone that's already been invited. So you want to see if you need to submit a pre-proposal or a letter of intent before you're allowed to submit, just to make sure you're covering all the bases and that it's appropriate for you. Another huge thing in the opportunities are deadlines. Many times we get used to certain deadlines and certain cycles, but different funding mechanisms may have a change of date. They could change just because of a holiday or a funding cycle. So always make sure you understand the dates. And many times it's not just the submission date, but you may have to have components of the grant in prior to certain the actual deadline. So make sure you understand what you want to turn in. Another important thing when you're reading these opportunities is making sure that you actually submit it to the right institution. There's nothing worse than finding out your grant's getting routed to the wrong place or the wrong person. Another thing that you want to make sure that you understand is when you're reading a funding opportunity is what we call facilities and administrative costs, and many times they can vary. And we hear about F&A or indirect costs. And facilities and administrative costs, what they're used for is some of the things that you may not think about, for lights in your office, if you're doing research, for heat, for the people that prepare your contracts, for the people that help you close out at the end of the year. These people in these activities are supported with your facilities and administrative costs. So certain opportunities, you may read them. Your institution, for example, may have a 50% rate that they apply to grants, but if you read a funding mechanism, it may actually have a lower rate. So you want to make sure you have all that straight before you work on putting together your proposal. And one of the other things that we don't think about very much is that you read a funding opportunity and you think you have it all battened down, and then you go to submit it and you find that maybe something's different. And actually funding opportunities can change. So for example, with the NIH, when you download a package to apply for a grant, they ask you if you want to be notified for changes. And that's always a good thing to do because there may be some subtle changes, but they're very important. And they could be, just related to the cost of what you're allowed to apply for travel and things. So make sure you always double check and you, at least, before you get to the deadline, make sure that the opportunity hasn't changed. So when you read a funding proposal, you want to make sure that what they're offering for funding can actually support what you're trying to do. For example, if there's effort restrictions, you may read a funding opportunity and it'll say that it'll support 40% of your efforts, which sounds really great. And then you read farther down and you find out, well, it will support 40% of your effort up to, $20,000. I'm coming up with a number there, but many times you got to make sure that it's something that you can actually support your salary and your institution's agreeing with for you to apply for. The other thing you want to always make sure too that there's not any unallowable costs. For example, if you think you're going to have to travel a lot, or there's going to be a lot of travel for your research project, and you find out that the travel is limited to $1,000, then maybe this isn't the best opportunity for you. So another thing that we want to think about when we're getting started is you want to make sure that you let your department, your institution know that you intend to submit a proposal. And that's really important, not just to announce yourself, but many times there's grants ahead of you in queue and they want to know that your grant is coming in. Many times with your department, they just want to make sure that they have the staff to support it. And for example, if you're working with an NIH deadline, our institution, I contacted our grants office and they really didn't want to talk about anything but grants until October 5th. So depending on different cycles and things, you may not be aware of a huge grant cycle, but you always want to let them know to make sure that you have plenty of time. And your institution may have timelines for you have to get your grant in at a certain time, but if they're busy, some of those timelines can change. So again, just talk to your department and your institution to see if there's any challenges to getting your grant in and meeting the deadline. So when you're thinking about who needs to, how you're going to be budgeting the trial, the first thing you need to understand is who really needs to be involved in your study. So you may have yourself and you're thinking of your coordinator or another investigator within your group that you know will be participating. You need to think about other things too for laboratories. So if you're going to be drawing blood, you may have this idea that you can draw the blood when you see the patient or the subject. But your institution may have charges just for storing blood. They may have a policy where someone from a phlebotomy needs to draw the blood. So you need to understand who all needs to be involved to start building out your costs. Some of the things that you don't think about are like storage and then pharmacy charges. Many times it's not an investigational drug that you're using, but if you're using any kind of even approved product and it's being dispensed, your institution may have a dispensing charge because it's part of a research project. And those are costs that you want to understand. Another thing that I think many times people underestimate is the amount of time that they're really going to need to spend on their project. And I added here to be honest, because, when we're excited about our ideas, we think, well, wow, we can, we'll put extra time into it. Or we think, well, we can take all of the call, you're going to be on call 24 hours, you're really involved. It's not going to, you don't need to bring somebody on because maybe you can't afford to bring them on because of the way the funding is structured. But you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't budget appropriately, because if you don't have enough support to do the study properly, then your chance of being successful really decreases. So really be honest about the amount of time that you're going to need. And I think another thing that we don't really think about when it comes to time is your administrative time. So you may be thinking that you're going to be available to enroll in different times, but there's going to be times you're going to need to be making phone calls, that you're going to need to be filling out forms, that you're going to need to be meeting with patients and families and your administrators like your IRB. So you need to figure out how much time that you're really going to put into participating in this research study. Another thing that we really don't think about that much, or we just take for granted, I should say, or seem to take for granted, is what kind of space you'll need. We maybe need office space, but many institutions, they find that they don't have enough places for their research coordinators to sit. So when you're thinking about space, you need to understand where people are going to sit and make sure that you've accounted for that. And many times there's charges for that. If you're working with a clinical trials office, they may have a surcharge for that. So make sure that you understand what kind of space you need. Another thing when you're trying to figure out how much to budget is take advantage of the research tools that are within your department or your institution. At our institution, we have research costing tools that they have available. We have a clinical research billing unit that people can contact to understand how much a study will cost. Because many times there's hidden cost, and when we have hidden cost, hidden costs are things, for example, you may have a medication, it's approved medication, but every time someone needs to hang a bag of the approved medication, there's a $60 charge. So talking with your institution and understanding what kind of cost considerations you have is a really good way to start identifying hidden costs. Another thing to do is, if you don't have a large research infrastructure at your institution, is benchmark with other institutions. For example, sometimes changes that you would have, they could be smaller changes. You may think that a bag of medication costs a certain amount, and then there's a shortage of the medication and the cost goes up. And another thing is that your institution may be getting a deal, but that deal may go away. So it's always good to understand what costs could be out there that you need to consider if you're going to do a study at your site. The other part that's great about benchmarking is that you find you need to collaborate with another institution, you kind of have an idea of what things cost other places. So if you were to add someone to participate in your study, you kind of have an idea and you've kind of budgeted for it. Another way is to look at historical data from other trials, and that's a good way. You can talk to your colleagues and see how much they've paid to do certain tests, or how much time they've had to spend to obtain a coordinator. Another way to understand how much you need to budget is ask a grants person or a finance person. And on the early discussions, many times we get a grants person or our medical schools involved a little later in the process. And they're really good at letting us know, for example, what is an allowable, what you can do that's an allowable cost. They're also really great at telling you if there's an anticipated change in some type of service. For example, if you have what we used to call the GCRC, and you were planning, your experience was using someone from your GCRC to help recruit patients or do exams, and you may not be aware that maybe the structure is going to change and those people will no longer be available for you. So it's always good to discuss with a grants person or a finance person right away. And they're the experts. They've dealt with all kinds of issues and different changes, and they're there to help, especially if you're medical school, because they want you to understand what you can and can't do before you turn in your proposal, and they send it back for a bunch of changes. Another thing to do is especially if you're doing a multi-center study, is to touch base with the coordinators and investigators. I think we talk to investigators a lot, especially about the science, but when we think about the conduct, we don't want to be in a situation where we think a coordinator salary may be a certain amount and then find out it's not. Especially if you're working with another part of the country, they may have union considerations. I remember a couple years ago we were discussing a study, and there was some discussion about, well, if you have a union, then you really can't do something. You have to hire someone in addition to. So there's things that may not be in the forefront of your mind when you're putting together your budget or your cost. That will come up. So it's always good, again, to involve a coordinator to participate in calculating your cost. And another thing that is important to do is to contact the funding organization when you have a question. If you look at a proposal, I'm thinking back a couple years ago when there was an opportunity where it said that you were supposed to spend $3,000. You were supposed to allocate $3,000 in travel, and the question was: is it only $3,000? Does it have to be $30,000? No less than $3,000? So reading different sections of it, it really wasn't clear. So if you have any questions, there's always a person to contact to ask them. It's better to ask the questions than to assume that you understand. If it's not very clear, then contact them right away, because there could be some requirements in there that you'd have to budget for that may change other components of your budget. So when we think about financial models, there's all kinds of different ways to pay people to participate in your research. And I think many times we think we have to provide effort for an investigator or a coordinator to participate, but there's so many different ways now that are out there. I just want to take a moment to explore some of those and talk about the good and the bad of each of those. So when we talk about funding trials and financial models, a lot of times we may find ourselves kind of not thinking out of the box per se, because there's many paradigms that people have about funding. So when here at the Net, we provide per subject payments, and they're a flat rate payment. And at the time, the way they come through, the type of agreement they come through, many institutions were confused because they weren't vendors or procurement agents. They were scientists, and they didn't understand why they were looking at a vendor agreement versus a subcontract. So when you explain what you're trying to accomplish, many times you think they won't participate because of the type of agreement or it's not a subcontract, but you can explain. And again, when people are talking about doing research, the study is a scientific study, but and you're not asking them to. I remember someone said, "Well, we're not selling hot dogs here." It's like, well, no, of course we're not. We're doing research, but there's different ways to provide the payments. As long as the activity is properly supported, you can work with people. But just kind of working through some of these things that may stop you from thinking out of the box when it comes to payments. Another thing that people think about is that when you're working, especially when you're collaborating, you may have an investigator that is participating in the science and they're very active. But when you're working with a protocol or they're enrolling subjects, it may still be viewed as a procurement or a vendor type agreement. We call it a hybrid purchase order here because it doesn't have to be a true subcontract for what they're doing. So there's different ways to look at that, but that's many times what you'll hear. Well, our investigators working in this capacity, and it doesn't mean that they can't because of the type of agreement, but there is flexibility there. The other part that we always think is that F&A rates are fixed and flat. So our institutions, they have a negotiated rate. So many times if you're working with budgets, your department may be willing to work with you on waiving or discussing modifications to the facilities and administration recovery. So it's always worth asking if you find that you have a budget that you can't exceed a certain limit and you need, you're looking for ways to conserve funds and get those to actually do the science. Many times your institution will talk with you. Another item that we need to think about when we think about paradigms is we can tend to think that enrollment will be evenly distributed across a group of sites. And I think, for those who enroll, it's not. So when you're trying to put together a budget, you may budget for each site to enroll 5 patients. And then you calculate, your rates and your costs for those 5 subjects across the sites. But then when you find out is that one site's enrolling 10 subjects, one site's enrolling 2, and your budget begins to get skewed. So you always want to think about that enrollment is not evenly distributed many times unless you have a specific set where you ask a place to enroll 5 patients and then they'll stop. But many times we don't because we're looking for opportunities to enroll. But if you don't have an agreement that's specifically like that, then you always got to think about how enrollment can change and that it's not a static. So when we're talking about what the best reimbursement strategy is, it could be that you're paying and supporting the effort for a site PI and a coordinator. And the good part about that is that they're available. But many times if you don't get started right away, then you're utilizing resources that you may not need to use while you're getting started. And then again, the issue about whether or not your institution can work with you on your F&A recovery. So again, what works best for you in your study? So when we think about how we pay investigators and participants in our study, there's different ways to provide them support. If there's opportunities for people to be consultants, and it matters really what they're doing for the trial. So if you have someone who you're utilizing their services a couple times a year, it may be appropriate to pay them as a consultant. And then you don't have to concern yourself with budgeting issues like calculating their fringe benefits or dealing with escalations in salary. You just provide a flat rate payment. The concern is many times with consultant payments is that if you're paying a consultant over a certain amount, then many times it's looked at as maybe you should be providing them effort if they're spending that much time. I know if many institutions, if you're a consultant making more than $10,000 in a payment, then there may be a question whether or not it's better to provide them with effort. Another challenge with paying collaborators as consultants is within their institution. Many institutions want to be made aware and provide permission for anyone to act as a consultant on a research grant because they want to evaluate whether or not it would be more appropriate to provide them with effort support. So that can be a stickler. It may seem straightforward that to pay someone as a consultant, but you really need to check and have the person check with their institution to make sure they're available to participate in that capacity. Another thing when we're talking about the collaborators are doing for the trial, they are participating in the science and they may be enrolling subjects, but the question is, are they enrolling subjects any differently than they're enrolling at site A than how they're enrolling subjects at site B? So if the answer is no, then it may be appropriate to pay them milestone payments versus providing a subcontract. And again, there's advantages to that of providing milestone payments, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. But again, depending on what they're doing for your study. And then what I've just shared is that the vendor versus a subcontract, you can be an investigator and still be a vendor. You don't always have to have a subcontract instrument. So I won't get too deep into the weeds with this slide, but commonly when people are trying to define whether or not someone needs a formal subcontract versus getting paid via a milestone payment or a consultant payment, the guidance reads that the person who's doing the work has to meet all of the criteria. So if someone's providing work and they don't meet one of these criteria, then it's appropriate to go ahead and pay them a vendor payment or a milestone payment. Again, this is from the OMB circular, which the OMB circular is the ultimate guidance document for how federal funds could be spent. Foundations may have different views on how funds can be spent, but when you're dealing with any kind of federal funding, that's what you need to pay attention to. So I just put this slide on here when we're thinking about different financial models. Does the relationship meet all the 5 criteria? If it doesn't, then we would follow the algorithm. Will they be following a standard protocol? And if they're following a protocol and it's a protocol that could be conducted at multiple sites, then it's okay to pay them through a milestone payment versus a subcontract. If they're doing something, if they're meeting all the 5 criteria, then it'd be a subcontract. And I just have that little bubble down there. So if you get to know at the end and something's wrong, you probably haven't answered the question in the best way. So, but usually people will fit into these 3 different categories. There's also the category of someone who's actually providing just a vendor service. And this could be someone who is analyzing blood or just acting as an agent to store blood. And those would be appropriately, those are clearly a procurement transaction, and you could just go ahead and use a vendor agreement. So one of the things that we think about, again, when we're thinking about how to pay people, if they're performing more than one function, so you may have someone who's a multiple PI and they're also enrolling. So if you do have that, you could consider treating them separately, and many times that is the cleaner way to do it. So you could have an agreement with 2 separate components within your agreement, or you could have one agreement with that has 2 pieces within the work scope that are well defined. I am kind of in favor of having 2 separate agreements just because of the work scope, and many times institutions, their F&A recovery, depending on what the work is being done, is different. So sometimes it's just cleaner to have 2 separate agreements. So when we talk about the cost of doing research, again, the consideration of indirect costs or facilities administrative costs. So when we're talking about what type of agreement to use, it seems like, well, gosh, we're getting them paid, so why would we spend so much time working that out? But there are some implications for that. So many times if you're using a subcontract, the facilities and administrative rate that you have to pay the other institution is higher. So you may, if you're supporting 10% of someone's effort and their facilities administrative rate is 75%, that means for every $1 that you pay for their salary, you're also giving them 75 cents on top of it for their institution. and that happens on the first $25,000 of the agreement. So you're paying a higher rate, you're paying a higher rate on all the dollars that you send there because all of their salary is entitled to assess this higher rate. So when we're talking about whether or not, well, it doesn't really make a difference, does it? Well, sometimes it does if you have a limited budget. Because especially if it's a 5-year study and you're paying them a certain amount, that 75 cents on every dollar is going to carry through the life of the trial. If you have a data center or someone that's collecting specimens for you, they may be like a CRO, Quintiles comes to mind right away. That's a contracted agreement. It's a purchase service agreement. So that's treated a little bit differently. It's a vendor procurement transaction. And your institution will have different ways of looking at that. And we'll talk about that in a moment because that can really be, it may sound like it's a nicer way to go, but again, that has implications as well. And then we have the per patient reimbursement rates, which are kind of a hybrid between a subcontract and a procurement transaction where you can average, you just provide a flat rate payment. So if the institution accepts and chooses to participate, they receive a flat rate payment. And if they have facilities and administrative costs, then they can take that out of that payment, or they can work with their institution on how much of that payment needs to go towards facilities administrative. So actually it works kind of nice because it gives people opportunities to enter into discussions with their institution on recovery there. Another thing that we can talk about when we're talking about the payments is we can try to understand and try to work on like an average rate to provide people. We do that here. We kind of look at what the FNA rate is across institutions, and then the cost of doing the study, and kind of add that for a flat rate payment. It's not specific that it has to be that amount, but we always have consideration. So that's always a good way to go through. You can always try to, consider, providing a flat rate payment and then adding people's FNA cost to that, but that's kind of hard to budget for. And so you really want to, if you're going to take this route, it's to your advantage to just provide a flat rate payment. So again, in all cases, what you want to do is just provide a single amount. It's just cleaner that way. So another thing about facilities administrative costs that sometimes may get left out of the equation is that we know if we're working with another collaborator and their rate is, we're providing 75 cents on every dollar of their salary that we budget for them. We understand that, but many times especially when people are new to research, they don't understand that their institution, it also assesses FNA on the dollars that are paid. So for example, if you have a subcontract with an institution, you're providing 75 cents to every dollar that you're providing for your collaborator's salary. Within your institution, for creating that agreement and administering that agreement, they may charge, let's say your FNA rate is 50%, your institution will assess they'll take 50 cents on every dollar of the first 25,000. So when you're budgeting, you need to not only think about the facilities administrative costs that you're providing to your collaborators, you need to think about the facilities administrative costs that are added on to the agreements that you're sending out. So I put this on there. Make sure before you develop your proposal, because with vendor agreements, for example, it may say, well, wow, I'm convinced. I don't want to do a subcontract. I want to do a vendor agreement because that sounds much cleaner and it's easier to budget. But if you talk to your institution, many institutions, when they have vendor agreements, they take their 50% on every single dollar, not just the first 25%. So you may decide that, the way that you want to budget is to provide a flat rate payment, and, you process it, and, your institution, they're up front. But if you're not very clear and have a discussion on how they're assessing it, they're like, yes, they need the funds there to support the research mission. So just make sure that when you're providing, however you want to go with that you have a discussion about how your F&A will be assessed, that your institution's assessing on the payments that are going out. Because you don't want to be surprised after you're funded and find out that your institution is actually taking a little bit more than you had budgeted for. So just to kind of, we've been talking about that, but just to kind of get in the weeds a little bit, just as a scenario here, if you were in a single center trial and, something that may come to mind. So the example here is you decide to collaborate and submit a proposal for a study on the effects of prone positioning in the ICU. Your colleague that you're working for, he's done research before. So he puts together a budget and he shares this budget with you and hands you these numbers, and your grant's going in, so you're gonna, you're excited to get going and meet with somebody to put these into a budget and for your proposal. So you can see the numbers there, the salary amount they're using. They have the effort there, and they have the totals. You can see the totals. So I just want to kind of take a quick poll and see what people understand that they would need to know next. So what would you want to know before you move forward or you turn this budget in? And there's a couple of choices there. So if you just have a couple moments and you're by your computer and you want to answer the poll. Okay, so it's kind of evening out where a majority of our group have answered all of the above, and then at 61%, and then the answer for A and C, we have people at 35%, and then 10% on the other items. So yeah, so these are all A and C, or pardon me, the last two answers could be correct. In this scenario, maybe A and C might be the more appropriate answers. So what we want to know is when we look at that budget again, we see there that it has a salary used of $240,000. So, is that the base salary? Is that, a salary for academic months? Is that a salary throughout the whole year? Is the fringe included in that salary? And that's really important because maybe your collaborator didn't consider the fringe benefits. He just knew how much the people, what their salary was, and he just put that amount in there. The other thing that's important too is when you see a salary like that, depending on the funding opportunity, they may not provide your full salary. They may, with the NIH, for example, they only provide an executive level salary, which is $181,500. So if you're collaborating with a faculty member that makes more than that, then you have considerations there. And that's where we get into what we call cost sharing. And that means that your institution says that if you want to spend 20% of your time doing research, that they will find a way to help support the rest of your salary so you can protect your time. Because when we're talking about effort and time, it's not about how much money you have, it's about how much effort you say you're going to give. So it's really important, again, to know what we're talking about with the amount of the salary and the fringe. The name of the coordinator who will be working on the project, well, first of all, you always want to know who you're working with. But when we're talking about the name of the coordinator, it may not be so important to know the name of the coordinator, but the level of coordinator that you need. For example, if you need someone who's going to be doing a certain procedure, like extracting blood or taking some type of samples, there may be somebody that requires some type of medical license, like a physician assistant or a nurse practitioner. And that person, their salary considerations are going to be much different than someone that you could hire who is a well-experienced coordinator, but doesn't help maintain a professional license. So the name of the person is important in a working relationship, but for a budgeting relationship, it may not be as important. You really want to know Again, it gets back to what their role is on the project and what they'll be doing and what their expertise needs to be when you're considering those questions. And then it's always about the role of the people involved. And so when we look at that, again, if we could just flip, let's flip back to that slide. The neuropsychologist there, the other part when we talk about roles is if you have a neuropsychologist there, is that somebody you need to pay effort for? Or is this someone that you could cover the cost of them just completing a specific amount of exams? For example, I don't know the actual rate that one would request for that, but let's just say you needed 10 exams and you were going to pay $200. If you had to work with your budget, is there an opportunity there? Or is this someone that you could pay for as a consultant and work with your budget and had some flexibility there? So again, roles are really important. So for those of you who are working with very distinct pathologies, many times at your institution, you may not see the number of subjects that you would need to see at your institution. So you want to collaborate with another institution. And it could be another institution across the country, or it could be someone within your own health system or someone just down the road. So when we're thinking about another scenario for multi-center clinical trials, you, in this scenario, you decide to submit a multi-center clinical trial. You have 11 institutions that you that have the patients you need, and you want to bring them on board. One of them is your institution. Two of them have lead investigators that are collaborating with you. It could be a multiple PI plan or someone who's very invested in developing the science. And maybe they're also going to see subjects. And then you have a data collection center that's working as a CRO. Many times we're working with, I know for the NET, we have our collaborators have a grant award. So I just use this as an example as a CRO, but many times your collaborators are funded individuals and would be treated like a subcontract. So again, they could be your lead investigator, could be someone who's involved with data management, or it could be someone who's more on the clinical side. And then you have 7 sites and enroll subjects. So for this trial, as an example, you're going to be enrolling 500 subjects at the 10 sites that are actually enrolling subjects. So in this scenario, some things you want to think about when you're doing a multi-center trial is startup costs. So we think about the effort for people at our sites, but what are the startup costs? There may be IRB filing fees. There could be costs for someone to actually do some of the regulatory work. There could be startup costs for setting up laboratory space or training. So you always want to think about your startup costs. It could be a flat amount for startup costs, or again, you could have where you're providing effort for people. With our group, many times our startup costs are milestone based, where we provide a certain amount of funds to conduct the activity. So when we're thinking multi-center trials, we need to think about startup costs. Again, do we want to provide effort / set funds for a coordinator, or leave it as a milestone payment? Will all the people at the sites be doing different types of work, or will they be doing the same work? Will your reimbursements be the same? For example, I know of a network that they have different tiers where people who participate in the research, if they're at an institution that has a typically higher F&A recovery, they may be in a higher payment tier than some institution that's at a lower F&A recovery. So, you want to think about how you're going to structure that. Another thing about multi-center travel is or multi-center studies is travel, because many times we have people that are that far. You don't have to have a meeting. I mean, right here is a great example of how we're telecommunicating and meeting electronically. But if you do have travel, you want to think about, are you going to provide the travel to the sites? Or do you want to keep the travel centrally? Many times if you do provide the travel to the sites, it's a flexible amount, so it could be reallocated. So if you're trying to conserve costs, there's some considerations when you're thinking about a multi-center study. So in this scenario, if we look at this, we have, based on some of the things we've already discussed, we would want to consider we have 2 subcontracts because we have institutions with multiple PIs or lead investigators. So we would need to provide effort for them because they're contributing directly to the science. We have 1 data coordinating center in this case, that's a CRO, it's a commercial group. So they could be brought on board using a purchase service agreement. And then we have the enrolling sites and 2 enrolling patients under lead investigators. So depending again how you want to set up your agreements, you could have 9 agreements, or you could have 7 agreements, and 2 of those agreements may have different wording or work scopes added in. Again, sometimes just working with separate agreements is just a little bit cleaner. The other thing is that many times the lead investigator, if he's a lead investigator, he may not be able, there may be a restriction on him enrolling subjects or interacting with patients about the study. So it may be another investigator in his institution. So many times having a separate agreement will help you work with that. So when we talk about, again, the benefits of per subject payments, we've discussed them in different contexts, but at the end of the day, when you're working with a per subject payment, when you're routing your proposal, because it's a per subject payment, it's a vendor agreement, you don't need to send paperwork through every single institution for institutional signature, which can take a long time and it's a lot of work. You can just put on your cost line, subject enrollments, and you're all set. And then you would just get a letter of intent or an agreement from the institution. Again, the patient costs are in a single line, so you're not breaking them out into multiple forms or multiple categories. You don't have to juggle 9 different price points and 9 different rates. You can just provide one in your agreement for the per subject payments. You just have 1 flat payment, so you don't have to do all that juggling and figuring. You can use a competitive enrollment. So if one site is enrolling like gangbusters and one site's not, then you're okay because you're budgeted appropriately. And if you have a site that the investigator moves and they just feel they can't do the study anymore, you could bring on another site to pick up. So when we got our budget together, we've determined what type of agreements we need, we've sorted out all of our hidden costs, so we're ready to go. So when we want to think about budgeting and what you do in the proposals to turn in the budget, a lot of times, we're more focused on budgeting, but I bring this up because it's something that you need to think about right up front, because it takes time when you're putting together your budget. So when we're talking about, when you do subcontracts, there's a lot more paperwork. You have to use institutional agreements and stuff like that. It takes longer. Also, too, subcontracts are a little bit harder to move. And purchase service agreements, again, when you're putting together a proposal, you would just get a quote and a letter saying they're going to participate. So you're all set with that, and you just include them in your budget. And when you're working with a hybrid purchase order, which, again, that we introduced that term earlier, but is what we use to pay per subject payments. Those, all you really need is a letter of intent, and it could be a letter of support, which we always usually ask our participants to provide. And then we just list the payments in the agreement and we're all set. So you can see the advantages, again, of the hybrid purchase order. Again, the downfall is how your institution wants to recover facilities administrative costs, whether or not it's a better thing for your budget. But when it comes to paperwork and budgeting paperwork, it's much simpler. So intent to participate letters, I just put this in here. I'm not going to talk about this, but you just want to make sure that if you're working with some of these different agreements that you get a letter from someone saying they're going to participate and what some of the terms are, because those, you don't want those changing after you're funded. So of course, everybody's got great ideas. You're going to be funded, so you get the award. So what happens after you get the award? So if we know something's going to be funded, it's a good idea to share with people, yay, this is funded, but until we find out really how much money we have, we should be concerned. Don't go ahead and do anything yet, because there could be cuts. Many times there are cuts. When you get the award notice, read the award notice, because again, there could be a cut, there could be restrictions, there could be some things you have to do before your money's funded. There could be changes in the the timeline of the funding, so just be aware of that. Touch base with your personnel at your sites. If you had a site that had agreed to participate when you turned in the grant 10 months ago and then investigators left for another institution, do you still want to work with the original institution, or do you want to consider continuing to work with the collaborator at his new institution? So it's always good before you establish agreements or you get things going to make sure that everything's the same as when you had originally budgeted. And then again, if you you want to revisit your budget, see again if anything has changed and revise it. And just let everybody know, because that's the time, if you need a revision, is revise it up front so everybody's expectations are there and the same. So I just put a couple resources there. Again, we mentioned the OMB, which is the guiding principle for federally funded agreements. Some of you who are already working in research have heard the term uniform guidance. The uniform guidance is some changes that they've made to how federal funds can be spent. For example, what you can, if you're going to buy a computer for a study or an investigator, what the terms are for that. So I would suggest that everybody take an opportunity if you're going to be looking at submitting a grant to understand if there's any changes, because those changes will affect your funding. I put this little fun link in there, if you've got a study, how to create an acronym, because we all like fun acronyms. So I thought this was a cute little link to add. And then just my information and my email address. So I guess we'll just open it up to, if anybody has any questions, we'll just try to go from there. We got about 7 minutes or so for questions. Okay, so we have someone who's typing. Excuse me. Okay, we had a couple of people that were typing, and but I don't see any questions appearing. Let me just make sure, double check, scroll down here, make sure I'm missing anybody. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, if you think of something later, and please feel free to email me. Like I said, my contact information's there. I want to thank all of you for your time. I know this was, there's probably all of these topics could probably be broken down into 45 minutes or an hour on their own. So we did cover a lot of ground, but again, I appreciate you joining me today, and it was a pleasure to be invited to participate.
Thank you, Val, for a great talk. It actually looks like there is a question if you wanted to address it in the chat box now.
Oh yeah, so acceptable costs for startup meetings. No, that's a great question. So it matters what funding agency you're working with. Acceptable costs are usually room rentals, the cost of AV rentals, travel rentals. Many times, depending on who you're working with, there could be restrictions on the cost of hotel rooms. So those kind of travel arrangements are appropriate. Where things get a little bit different and you need to pay attention to is the cost of meals and paying for food. So if you're getting together for a meeting and it's to foster collaboration, you may find yourself in what we call hosting, where that's not an appropriate use. But if you have people who are on travel status that are there for training and are there for dissemination of results or specifically for the work of the study, then you can provide food there. But whenever we get these questions, it circles back around to talk to the sponsor who's providing the award to see what they consider allowable or appropriate. Many times it's just a limit, the thinking back, no one wants to see, people with, in hot tubs having filet mignon. I use that as an example because that was something that was in a newspaper a while ago. So you just always want to be conscientious of what your costs are. But no, that's a great question.
Okay. Well, thank you, Val, again for sharing a great talk with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please join us again in November 20th at 12 noon. We will be having our next webinar presented by Dr. Karen Johnston and a panel who will be discussing how to prepare a grant application. And also on December 18th, we will have Dr. John Marler from the FDA presenting on IDEs and INDs for sponsor investigators. So thank you again for joining us. And if you have any questions, please send an email to ninds-ctmc-info@umich.edu. And we appreciate everyone joining us today.
Thanks.